Welcome back to our latest We Are Sunderland briefing with myself, Dom Shaw, and Scott Wilson. And thanks as ever to our partners, the Fans Museum in Sunderland and Cost Specs Opticians. We're nearly at the end of the first international break of the season, a break which can't end soon enough really for Sunderland on the back of that blistering start to the season. At the back end of the first week of the break, Scott, you were over at the Academy of Light speaking to Kristjaan Speman. We're going to have a good deep dive into that chat today really and what came out of it. But just to start with, what was kind of the main conclusions you came away?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, to be fair to Sunderland and to be fair to Kristjaan Speman, they've started doing this on a slightly more regular basis, where probably a couple of times a year he'll have two or three of us from the local press in and just have a bit of a chinwag about the state of play and what's been happening really. And it is useful because, you know, in days gone by, if you spoke to the manager, and obviously we regularly do that, both of us don't we, at press conferences, then you could get a handle of him really on everything that was going on at the club. Nowadays, as we know, recruitment issues, contract issues, all that kind of stuff, an awful lot of that is out of the manager's hands. So I think even more so when you've got someone like Bris, who clearly is happy being a coach rather than an old school manager. You know, if he's the only person you're speaking to, then often there's a lot of stuff kind of slips through the cracks and you don't get a real handle on. So the fact that you're able to speak to the sporting director and have that dialogue is really useful. And yeah, it was good. We were up there for maybe 45 minutes or so. And as ever with Speakman, really nothing was off the table, nothing was off limits. He was quite happy to chat about kind of everything that was raised. So in terms of the main points, Jack Clarke, I think we'll get to you know what was going on there. I thought one of the real key takeaways was the fact that you know, yes, they sold Jack Clarke, but Kristjaan Speman was very keen to stress that they'd actually turned down bids and interest in, and I think his words were 7 or 8 of our players. So we can probably dive into that in a minute because I think that's pretty important and interesting. Some good stuff on contracts and kind of keeping the key men and contracts that are starting to get near. Some interesting stuff on players that came in. I thought it was particularly interesting on Milan Aleksic, who obviously we don't know an awful lot about, but he was quite good on him. So lots of stuff covered, but obviously off the back of the transfer window, ins and outs were the main thrust of it.
You touched on there, Ricardo, the opportunity to speak to Speakman. It's kind of one of the difficulties of I guess the football industry really, isn't it? And that it's managers, it's only head coaches who we regularly get to speak to. And so often these days, there are questions that you're putting to him and it kind of feels like it's unfair to be asking a manager this, but we don't get the opportunity to ask anyone else really. So we have to ask you because you're the kind of talking head of the club. Whereas when you get the opportunity to sit down with a sporting director, head of football, whatever it is like that, it does give you the chance to dive into issues that you don't ordinarily get. And I realise it's clearly easier for someone in Speakman's position to do this on the back of such a brilliant start to the season and the pressure isn't on, but it's still incredibly helpful. On the outs then, first of all, obviously the Jack Clarke issue, those 7 or 8 other players, without getting into a guessing game, kind of the obvious candidates, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know that there was pretty strong interest in Joe Bellingham very early in the window before he signed that contract. We know that there was interest in Tommy Watson from Brighton very, very late in the window, and Speakman was pretty open in saying, you know, yes, there was bids for Watson late on, but they didn't come anywhere near where Sunderland would value him, and he's a player they think a massive amount about. I think his development's going to be interesting. And then in the intervening period, I mean, you know, you'd immediately think of the obvious, wouldn't you? Neil, Ballard, Hume, Patterson. You know, they're the players that are going to be attracting interest from Sunderland because of the point they're at in their development, their ages, and the quality of, you know, their performances in the Championship to date. So I think the message was, and you know, obviously you go into these things with your eyes open. Clearly, part of the reason that Kristjaan Speman agrees to do this is because he does want to put across a certain message. And I think the message was, look, you know, yes, we sold Jack Clarke. Yes, we sold Ross Stewart when the time was right. But we don't want fans to think, and we don't want other clubs to think, that we're a selling club and we're just going to get rid of assets every transfer window. You know, everybody at Sunderland knows they're sitting on a potential goldmine in these young players. But I think the message was very much, we are sitting on a gold mine, but we're also sitting on a squad that we think can take us to the Premier League. And that's more important to us than cashing in. Now, does that mean in January or in the summer, if Sunderland is still a Championship club, they won't sell another asset? No, it doesn't mean that, because there is still a financial reality to this, and players will get to a point in their career where they'll be demanding almost a move to the Premier League if that's what's on offer. But I think at the moment, the overriding message is very much, we're not a club that are going to be looking to sell our leading assets because we think those assets can take us to the Premier League.
Obviously, the one that did go, Jack Clarke, and I guess the obvious question from that is what happens with the money that Sunderland received for Jack Clarke. Now, I know players came in the final days of the window. Milan Alexic, who you touched on there, we'll talk about more, but there was no major significant, 5, 6, 7, 8 million pounds out there. Will there be in January or next summer, or is that not in Sunderland's thinking? Will they stick to the model? How will they go about spending? Will they go about spending that money that they got?
I think it's a bit of both. And that was, again, the kind of message that I think Speakman wanted to get over, which was, look, there is money there. There's money to spend. We're in a very secure financial position. We've got no FFP worries. Yes, money has come in from Jack Clarke. He will say that Sunderland have invested in every transfer window under the current ownership, and they have to a certain level. But he'll also say there is money there. But then on the flip side of that is, the model is not, let's spend the money because the money's there. The model is, we'll be constantly reassessing over the next 2 or 3 months. Let's see where we are in January. If there are obvious gaps in the squad, if there's a real injury crisis and there's an issue, if players become available that we think are massively desirable, then there is money there to do those deals. But just because we've got, 5 million, 6 million, 8 million sat in a pot, that doesn't mean we feel the need to spend 5 million, 7 million, 8 million in the next window or 2 windows. So I think it's very much that look, we're in a good financial position. There's money there to spend if we think it's going in the right direction. But just because we've got X amount of million for Jack Clarke doesn't mean that we have to spend X amount of million in the next window, 2 windows, 3 windows, whatever.
And I guess the other question to come out the transfer window, despite the fact that obviously Sunderland have had such a positive start to the season, is the striker thing. Have they left themselves short up front? Now, I know Abdullahi came in the final day, but what's the feeling inside the club on where Sunderland are at? Do they think they've got enough up front?
I think the feeling within the club was that they would have been willing to do another striker deal if they thought there was one to be done. And we know that there was very late interest in deadline day on Fofana from Chelsea, who was obviously just moved off to Greece today. That deal didn't get done. And while Speakman wasn't willing to speak directly on this, I think that was from the Chelsea end rather than the Sunderland end. I think they would have done that deal. So I think there's a feeling that, yes, another striker could have come in. I think it was going to be a certain type of striker. I don't think they were ever going to go out and spend 7, 8 million, 10 million on a, if you like, proven Championship player. I don't think that was ever part of the equation. Partly, I think that's obviously because Mayenda has hit the ground running and has done well. I think it's partly because they feel that Abdullahi can come in and play a prominent role. I think they feel as well that in Wilson Isidore and to a slightly lesser extent, Alexic, they've signed players who can play not as a old-fashioned 9, but as a central striker in some kind of formation if they need them to. So I think they feel. I don't think they feel that they're horrendously short. And I know some fans will say, "Well, you have left yourselves horrendously short," and that's a debate to be had. But I think that they would also concede that, had they been able to, yes, they maybe would have brought in one more up front.
And the other deals that were done this summer were contracts, several key contracts. Chris Rigg, Joe Bellingham obviously stand out, Dan Ballard, and yet the two that might concern fans, I guess, at the minute are Dan Neil and Dennis Sirkin, especially with the developments earlier this summer when Neil was said to have rejected Sunderland's first offer. Now, at that stage, that was when the identity of the next head coach was still uncertain. And we had no idea how the picture was going to look, did we, for Sunderland in the early weeks of the season? Obviously, things have changed significantly. And you asked Speakman about that.
Yeah, and it was very much, yes, that's right on the top of our to-do list. You know, I think Sunderland do deserve credit for the contract work rather that they've done this summer, because, like you say, getting Bellingham was clearly a really big one. Ballard felt like a really, really big one as well. You know, that is important, and I think they've done really well there. But Neil and Sirkin are the two that are now into the final 2 years of their contracts. That was obviously the same situation that Jack Clark was in. You know, I don't think Sunderland are fretting about this. You know, yes, we know that there was the Neil initial kind of stumbling block, but like you say, I think there's a feeling on all sides there that happened at a time when signing a new contract wasn't necessarily going to be the right thing for Neil to do, because there was just so much uncertainty around so much of the club. Well, a lot of that's been resolved now. So I think, you know, people will be getting back around the table between now and Christmas. And I think the hope would be that there'll be developments on both of those fronts. But as I say, Sunderland, you know, not terrified about the prospect at the moment, because with more than 18 months, they do still have a slight degree of security there.
The other kind of strong news line, I'm aware I'm just flying through them here, but there was a fair bit to come from it, wasn't there? Is Régis Lebris's backroom team. There's still been no changes there. It was interesting to hear him talk about the developments last month, where they thought they were getting close to someone, and that ended up falling through. Where are we at as things stand on that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, because I have to be absolutely honest that you know, neither of us got wind of that. And to be fair, the other press lads who were there as part of this briefing and interview, it was kind of news to all of us, really. So you know, while that had clearly got a certain distance down the track, Sunderland had managed to keep that very, very quiet, which maybe makes you think that it was someone from overseas, and so the kind of agent chatter around this country wasn't so big on it. That's a bit of surmising there. That's absolutely not from anything that was said during the interview. But it was clear that Sunderland had identified someone. Bris and Speakman, I'm led to believe, had both spoken to this person. It was pretty well down the line, and then for whatever reason, it didn't happen. Now that was kind of at the start of last month, and I think the feeling then was, look, we're getting very close to the start of the season now. We're getting very close to peak transfer window chaos. So I don't think it makes sense to chuck another you know, major issue into the pot there and start looking at other candidates and start the interview process again. But we're at that point now where that is going to happen. So, you know, I think Sunderland do have a list of alternative options. Again, Bris has been very much involved in this process. So, you know, I think that is back to being ongoing. And I think the hope will be that will be resolved relatively quickly, although the fact that they've gone to one person and it hasn't happened obviously means that to a slight degree they've gone backwards in the process to then move forwards again.
Is it still a priority, do you think? I'm on about like just us chatting here, because when Bris came in, I guess one of the kind of anxieties I think of Sunderland fans was, we've seen how this works with the manager, head coach just coming in on their own. They need kind of their man, you know, whether it's a sounding board, a friend, whatever to kind of act as an ally in the backroom team. Now, obviously, they've had the flying start to the season, supported by largely the team that were there last season. So would it be an issue if Bris went forward without anyone coming in, do you think? Would it be one of those where if Sunderland's form was to nosedive, then that would crop up as an issue again? Do you think it's something that still needs addressing?
I think it is something that needs addressing. Yeah, I mean, you're right in what you say. The worry, I think the worry was twofold, wasn't it? It was one that Bris was not going to have anyone to kind of use as a sounding board and fall back on and have a confidant, and I think the lack of that was a major issue when things started to unravel really quickly with Michael Beale. And then, you know, let's not beat about the bush here. The reality is that the existing members of Sunderland's backroom team were seen, certainly by some supporters, as being tainted, if not fairly toxic. Well, that's dampened down a little bit, partly just through the passage of time and partly because, as you say, results have been so positive at the start of the season. And thus far, Bris doesn't seem to be in any way perturbed by the lack of a right-hand man or a number two, whatever. So So I think, the urgency has maybe disappeared a little bit, but I think the general overriding need for an assistant and for someone to be in that role and to play a senior role within the current backroom group and be that link between Bris and the dressing room or the rest of the coaching staff or however it might play out. I think that's all still there. And just in terms of numbers, Sunderland's senior coaching team is still pretty light. Now, Speakman was hinting that actually there's probably going to be a bit of reshuffling around there, and a couple of internal figures will probably become more senior and play a more on role within that first team group. So that will help, but I don't think it removes the need for an assistant. And to be fair, I think everyone at the club knows that.
You touched on Tommy Watson a bit earlier. Obviously, Brighton came in very late in the window and had a nibble, and Sunderland rejected that. What's the plan with Watson? Is the kind of thinking that he could be a major player this season, or Sunderland are relatively well stocked in that area? Will they be patient with him and just allow him time to kind of come through when he's really ready? Is he ready already?
I mean, I think it's a bit of both. They will give him time, and there's not, as we've just said there, a pressing need to get Tommy Watson into the first team and get him in the starting lineup, because as we've said, for all that, I think we all accept they probably could have done with another striker. There are options there, and Mayenda's obviously started the season very well. But I think the internal feeling is that he is the most exciting of the crop that is just coming through next, and obviously have done very well. Got to the Premier League 2 cup final, are playing tonight, isn't it, in their first game of the international matches against Athletic Bilbao. Clearly that development is going to be massive for people like Watson to be involved in, and all the youngsters at Sunderland, to be fair. There's not going to be a rush to get him in the first team environment, but I think there's a feeling that he can get there this season. Yeah, I think the thinking is very much that at some stage this season, expect to see Tommy Watson getting match minutes for the first team. I mean, he's already been in and around the squad in the early weeks of the season, hasn't he? So, with that many substitutes now, it does make it a little bit easier to have a couple of youngsters regularly as part of that first team group. And then I guess it's when they get the chance, how do they take it? But, I think we'll see Watson getting match minutes, yeah.
And what about the 3 deadline day signings? Well, 4, but we'll get to Chris Mepham. The 3 kind of, I guess, younger players but deemed to have more potential: Alexic, Abdullahi and Salis Abdul Samed. When do you think we can expect to see them? How big a part will they have to play this season? I mean, obviously Samed's alone, so you think he's going to play a role, but yeah, how central, how ready are they? How central figures can they be?
Well, Samed is the most experienced, isn't he? And he feels like the one who could probably go in relatively quickly. Now, again, he's going into a central midfield area that even without Pierre Ekwe is pretty well stocked, isn't it? Given how well Chris Rigg, if we say that Chris Rigg has made himself largely undroppable in these early weeks of the season, which I think we would all accept with his performances that to a large extent he has, then throw in Dan Neil, throw in Joe Bellingham, throw in Alan Brown, and it's pretty obvious that Samed is going to have a battle to get into that team. Having said that, I suspect he'll be in the squad at the weekend down at Plymouth. And I don't think it'll be too long before we start seeing him maybe coming off the bench and competing for a place in there. Alexic, I think, is the one they're most excited about. But because of that, I think he's also the one that they are going to be most careful with. I think, the general acceptance is that someone had paid about 3 million for him. Now, that's a lot of money for someone who's kind of as untried as he is. But having said that, he was in the Serbian full national squad in this international break. So, he has made major strides at a very, very young age. And Sunderland, openly, Kristjaan Speakman admitted, had a lot of competition from other clubs. By no means we're offering the most money, but we're able to offer evidence that youngsters get a chance at this football club. And, if you come here, we will help you develop your career. And increasingly, I think that's a really important selling point that Sunderland have in their favour. So I think he's the one they're most excited about. But again, Speakman was at pains to kind of say his English isn't great. He's obviously moving to a new country. We want to get him settled. So I think it's a bit of a watch this space with Alexic, but I think there is real excitement about what he could offer as an attacker midfielder. And then Abdullahi, I think a lot of that will depend on how the other strikers fare. I mean, it's Mayenda's place to lose at the minute, isn't it? Then you've got Rusin, then you've got Isidore, who while playing predominantly off the left, could go through the middle if he was needed. Abdullahi is going to be part of that mix. And I think the speed with which we start seeing him will depend to a certain degree on, do the other strikers stay fit and what kind of form are they in?
And we touched on this last week, but Mepham's an interesting one, isn't he? Because he's at a stage of his career and he's the profile of player where he's not going to be happy to come in and just be cover, just be a squad player. He's going to want to play, isn't he? And get his career back on track, really, after losing his place at Bournemouth last season.
Yeah, and obviously we've got Dan Ballard and we've got Luke O'Nien who have started the season ever so well with Sunderland kit. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, Mepham is going to have a fight, but he is a different type than Sunderland have tended to bring in, isn't he? Let's be openly honest about it. And as you say, given the stage of his career and given that he kind of said part of the reason was because I want to keep my international place, well, he's going to expect to be playing relatively quickly. So it's going to be interesting to see how that one in particular pans out, I think, because it's very, very hard to see Dan Ballard not in the starting lineup. And, for all the, as I've said, I think on previous vids, Luke O'Nien does divide opinion, but he's played very well at the start of this season. He's a massive figure in terms of the dressing room and just the team environment. And he seems to have very quickly developed a pretty close relationship with Bris. So, yeah, how and when Mepham fits in, I think will be interesting to see.
I know we can't be too picky, really, after such a perfect start to the league season. But it's a shame Sunderland were knocked out of the Carabao Cup because a second game now would be ideal for several players, wouldn't it? Just to give them a bit of much-needed game time, really, and help them.
Yeah, because for all that we always talk about the hectic championship schedule and all this kind of carry on, actually, there's not an awful lot of midweek matches, even between now and Christmas, and there's 2 more international breaks are going to split things up. So yeah, there are going to be players on the fringe of this Sunderland squad who are really struggling to get the kick of a ball, especially because 2 or 3 of the ones that we thought might leave did this. So, there are areas of the squad where it's actually quite bloated.
Yeah, I mean, Bennett, Rusin both bring to mind, don't they? Especially if Abdullahi comes in and makes kind of sets off relatively positively. You would think that's going to push Rusin further down the pecking order, and game time might be harder to come by. The next game is obviously Plymouth, and it feels like a good opportunity for someone to extend this perfect start, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, Wayne Rooney's Plymouth. It's not exactly. Well, I say it's not gone to plan. It hasn't gone to plan. It's kind of gone how a few of us thought it might. I think, given Rooney's struggles in some of his more recent jobs. But
I do wonder whether he'll be tempted to play himself. Did you see any footage from that charity game?
Belly.
Yeah. Well, but I'll tell you what.
It was a good free kick, though, wasn't it? Yeah. Free kick. But he was certainly filling that shirt. I think that's
absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, it's a good game. It feels like a good game. It feels like a really, another kind of winnable opportunity. It feels a bit like dare I say it, a bit like the Cardiff and Portsmouth games, and Sunderland dealt with them really well. It feels like that kind of away game. So listen, the championship's the championship. Let's see what happens. And sometimes straight off the back of an international break, some strange things can happen, even in the championship as well as the Premier League. But no, I mean, listen, if you were looking for a game to try and make it 5 out of 5, then Plymouth will be right at the top of your list probably of teams that you'd be looking to take on. So there's every chance for them. It feels like that.
And just to wrap up, I know you touched on it with Samed, but do you expect any of the new lads to be involved?
I wouldn't have thought so in the starting lineup. I'd be surprised at that. mainly because I just don't think there's any need to, is there?
No.
You know,
well, in the squad, do you think they'll be part of
yeah, I think there'll be a couple in the squad, and that might reduce the options for like a Tommy Watson or whatever to be included in the match day group, which is not necessarily a bad thing every week, is it? You know what I mean? It wouldn't surprise me if Samed was in the squad, and I would expect Metham to be in the squad. I'd probably expect Alexic to be in the squad, to be perfectly honest, even though there's the talk of taking it slowly with him and things like that. I think given how highly they rate him, I think they probably want him in the squad. So, yeah, at least 2 or 3 on the bench, I would think.
And I think for all we're talking here about the options Bris has got in several areas now. When you looked at the bench in that Portsmouth game, there was 2 or 3 young lads in there, and you thought then is depth an issue in certain areas. So there's that element. And the other thing, I think, with a player like Alexic, it's an opportunity to get him involved with the travelling, being around the lads, and all that element, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that will help him settle, won't it? Feeling that he's part of the group, being within the squad, getting to know people, getting to know the senior figures within the dressing room, especially with, let's be honest, Plymouth away, it'll be a flight. It's almost like a little blooming 2-day pre-season trip, isn't it? All the way down to Plymouth. So yeah, I think you're right. Partly for that reason, I think we'll see at least 2 or 3 of the newer lads in there.
And we're not going to get into it now because obviously we've got videos to do in the next few weeks. But the fixtures, if you're watching on YouTube rather than listening on your podcast platform, we've got the next 5 fixtures running across the bottom of the screen. And after Plymouth, you've got Middlesbrough at home, Watford away, Derby home, Leeds at home. 3 of those 4 games should tell us a lot more, I think, about Sunderland and the credentials. That's not to say that Sunderland haven't played anyone hellfire. They beat Burnley at the Stadium of Light. So it's not a case of looking and thinking Sunderland have had a kind start to the season, but I think that'll tell us a bit more. Just before we get to predictions, as we said, if you're watching, you might have seen running across the bottom of the screen, you can subscribe to We Are Sunderland for just £1 for 6 months or 12 quid for the full year. And after... subscribers ahead of that Middlesbrough game a week on Saturday, subscribers can get involved in a competition to win tickets to that game, which promises to be an absolute belter. So if you haven't subscribed yet to We Are Sunderland, get yourself signed up and you'll be in with a chance of winning those tickets. Predictions Saturday, confident of another victory?
I am confident, yeah. I mean, it's an away game, so I suppose, you can never really take anything for granted. But I just think that pre-season, it looked like Plymouth were going to be one of the strugglers in the league. Everything that's happened on the pitch so far suggests that will be the case. Sunderland full of confidence, playing well. No major absentees, or certainly that we're aware of. Obviously, Bris will do his press conference on Thursday. We'll maybe get a bit more of a sense on it then. We're recording on Wednesday afternoon, but as things stand, no major absentees. So yeah, I'm definitely going to go Sunderland. I'm going to go 2-0 Sunderland.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm just not convinced Plymouth will be able to make life difficult enough for Sunderland to knock them out of the stride. And like you say, I think Sunderland will go there with such confidence and positivity. And you can't see them not scoring, can you? You can't see Plymouth keeping Sunderland out. And they've been so solid defensively. I think it all points towards a Sunderland win. And Christ almighty, if you compare this with a couple of months ago.
Exactly. Nobody saw this coming.
Well, safe travels. Again, I think it's worth pointing out some of the trips haven't been kind, have they? In terms of distance.
No, and this is the harshest of the lot, isn't it? Plymouth away. We've all been down there before. It's quite a schlep.
So safe travels if you're making the journey this weekend. Enjoy, and as we said before the Portsmouth game, hopefully you'll come back with the 3 points. If you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, and do that. And as I said, subscribe to We Are Sunderland to be in with a chance of winning those Middlesbrough tickets. And if you're listening on your podcast platforms, then rate and review on there. We'd appreciate that. But thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for the feedback. Enjoy the game this weekend if you go in. Here's hoping for another positive result. And we'll be back next week with another We Are Sunderland briefing.